I saw Ateya Khorakiwala's work for the first time last year. She presented parts of her doctoral research that focused on grain silos in India and how they were a post-colonial import, built not just for the purpose of creating food security after witnessing one of the worst famines in the country, but also to serve as a currency for exchange. This commodification of grains came loaded with questions about its storage infrastructure, particularly with silos becoming political and economic instruments to manage the supply of grains. In today's conversation, Ateya talks about the history of silos, its construction materials, and her course called Feasting and Fasting at Columbia University. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not necessarily occupy center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. We'll begin by talking about your work first on silos. So before we get into that, I thought we'll take a quick stock of where the idea of silos, or where silos as these large containers, building elements, whatever you want to call it, came to India. The first instance was, before even getting there, I was wondering while reading your work. So before silos came to India as a result of the Bengal famine, which were gifted by the Americans to India, what was the infrastructure? What were the different ways in which grain storage was done?
Hi, Vaishnavi. Good morning. Maybe that's not whenever people hear this. I thank you for asking me all these questions. Thank you for reading all of my work. I'm excited to talk to you about it today. I hope I can tie together some of the strands of, architectural thinking and economic thinking and grain and some of the things that we see in how the landscape itself has been transformed in relation to the history of famine. This is something I'm very passionate about and interested in. I think that the question you just asked me was a question of, if we think of silos as a post-colonial intervention in preventing or addressing shortages in grain, shortages in food, in how states in general address the problem of how food will reach the people who need to consume it, then what are ways that same problem was addressed in other sort of political economies? I think that the silo is a very specific kind of intervention, and we can talk about that a little bit more. The larger question here is what needed to happen so that food grains become a kind of problem of the state, right? What needed to happen so that first of all, there becomes a separation between where grain is produced and where it is consumed. And then what needs to happen so that food can move from the point of production to the point of consumption, which is to say that one of the things that I was really fascinated by is this idea that X is the granary of Y. An example of that might be Punjab is the granary of India, or some place is the granary of England. And what that means, and that phrase, if you look in archival documents, in reports and things, when does that particular model of phrasing emerge, that one place is supplying all of the food needs of another place? Now, there are two parts to this history. Part one is that it reflects the specialization of land, that we must think about certain parcels of land as productive only in specific ways. So if some land has some kind of soil, then it should only grow the one thing that it is really good at, or that if it has some climate, then it should really only grow the one thing that place is perfect for growing, which is a very modern way of thinking about agriculture, as opposed to an idea that a piece of land is there to serve not an economy in general, but a smaller, bounded regional need or local need. And so that then creates a separation between where things will be produced and where they will be consumed. The other part of this is that it led to an increasingly anxious set of debates in many different places. So in England itself, there is this debate that's happening in the 18th century, which is that, oh my God, England, we're now dependent on grain from, outside. What will happen if somehow that connection gets severed? How will we feed our population? This is precisely what happens in the early part of World War II, when India's relationship to Burma, Myanmar, gets severed, and suddenly there is this sort of precipitous decline in the amount of rice that you are able to import. So on the one hand, that particular colonial model of political economy produces this thing that we now understand as X is the granary of Y. It produces that kind of separation, but it also produces a kind of anxiety about that separation that leads to a certain kind of nationalist and state interest in managing the agricultural production. So you see there's a kind of double movement that happens as a result of that particular political economy. So the answer to your question is that this silo, which here we can think of not as a physical object, but as a model of who stores what, emerges, so in this case, it would really be warehouses, which we're referring to governments actually managing warehouses and the storing of grain, emerges as a result of this double move. One, that we need to produce food in large quantities to feed increasingly urban populations in various places around the world, armies, all sorts of new bodies of people who exist in ways that are responding to colonial pressures, or pressures of mobility, of responding to new urban economies, etc. And on the other, this rising nationalist fervor that we should not be dependent on outsiders. Does that make sense? Did I get to some of the things you were trying to?
My question, however, is, so if you think about grains and food and the traditional barter systems around which food or grains became the central object or good of trade. So for example, in your essay and in your dissertation, you refer to what Amartya Sen called the exchangeable entitlements, right? Wherein, say, farmers in Bengal would receive rice in exchange for their labor, or even when you look at the monarchies back in the day, or the kings which ruled, and they would always ask for grain as a tax, like a mode of controlling tax. So Lagan and all the movies that came after, right? The idea of having grains as a valuable commodity that before the idea of money came in was used to exchange services or goods, or even get tax from different subjects of the state. You think the introduction of silos somewhere changed the notion of grains as something that could be used as a commodity for exchange and then translated into a commodity that had to be stored for specific reasons? Do you think there was a shift in the idea of what grain was, as of course something that is way beyond a food item and something that exists largely in the economy as different things at different points in time?
Yeah. So this is a fascinating question and a fascinating, I think, set of ideas that you've pulled out, which is that what is the relationship between grain as something we consume and something we eat and destroy, and money, which is something that is extremely stable. When you use money, you don't destroy money. Everything else that we use, most of the other things that we use the word consumption has a nature
They're
of destruction.
consumables, yes, correct.
Exactly. And consumption, of course, will become the word that will define how we relate to commodities in general, consumer commodities. So the question, in a sense, is about in what ways does grain play this double role? One, as a representation of money, because all money needs some form of representation, right? If you look at banknotes, it is a representation of an idea of
It's a
money.
currency in some way.
Yes, and it is, in a sense, a representation of a contract of debt, that I owe you something, I give you this note, and the note guarantees that you can consume the value of that money. Money is one of the few things that you can that you use it and it doesn't get destroyed. Somebody else can take that money and then, it circulates. Grain has to do this double role. It has to function both as cash and both as object of to be consumed. When you use grain as tax, I would not call that barter. I would call that grain playing its money form, grain being acting in its money form. And so any kind of, landlord or landowning class that would then tax farmers invoke grain in that cash form. What I do think happens is that grain suffers because of its very particular, all food cannot serve as money, because fruits, vegetables, these are extremely perishable. Because grain has a certain capacity to last, because it is a seed and seeds have this biological need to protect themselves so that they can, germinate in other times when the conditions are favorable, it has a tendency and a capacity to act in a money form as well. And so the silo, I think what it does is it creates a kind of chemical environment and a physical environment for grain to perform its money role, its value role, its capacity to become a commodity through which we can exchange rather than a commodity that we consume. And that is what I found interesting about a silo, that it creates the physical conditions in which grain acts in its money form rather than in its a form of food, in its food form.
But also as this extremely valuable asset that you need to store for times of crisis so that it's still in its money form can be traded. And you speak about all the different people who are involved in that kind of economy in terms of exercising what is allocated where and how does grain move in the overall country or the system. What I found more interesting was the introduction of silos in India. And you do speak about how it's a colonial, post-colonial import when, as a result of the Bengal famine, India gets a couple of these silos from America, two of which you detail out very nicely. These are the two silos which were made out of galvanized iron. And somewhere later in your work, you also talk about the silos which were built in the 1970s, where the material of construction of those silos kind of transitioned somewhere from a galvanized iron to concrete silos. And it somehow, I felt, was a good indication of all the technological developments that were happening within India, but also in the construction industry in terms of concrete. And at this point, I'm specifically thinking about a professor at GSAPP, Gauri Bharat, who's currently writing a book on the advancement of concrete in India. Mm-hmm. And so I was just starting to think about it. It's almost like when you look at the timeline, you can see those parallel developments, one which is happening in the construction and material industry, and one where in the food industry, you are seeing the translation of materials. So if you were to reflect on the material cultures of silos, just to look at it from a more infrastructure architecture perspective, what was that shift like in terms of size, scale, resources, labor, and of course the capital that went into building these silos from, say, its first import somewhere in the late 40s, early 50s to the 70s, when there's a lot of concrete being poured there, and also these silos are getting built around the country?
One of the things I find fascinating about the material of cement, but also concrete, so cement in its form in which it ends up in concrete, cement in terms of it being a component of concrete, is that it has this capacity to be used at different scales. You can range from laborer and a contractor mixing concrete on site to build something, all the way to ready mix concrete being, made based on a very precise formula for a very precise structural purpose that will have to reach site at exactly a particular time so that it can be poured in a particular order, so that that pouring can produce extremely precise structural outcomes. Like it can take loads and forces in very specific ways. So, for example, I'm thinking about flyovers. That is the word that I was looking for. So, to produce flyovers, you need very precise sets of, you need very precise abilities to take load. And that capacity to scale the use of cement, I think, has been extremely key to why it is such a successful material. You can work with different levels of expertise. I think that has been central to to why cement and cement concrete, reinforced cement concrete as well, became such a key material in the early to mid 20th century, when it kind of explodes as a tool by which to construct the newly the urban explosion that we see. There are of course some interesting stories over there about how importing cement is cheaper, because to produce your own cement you actually need quite complicated and robust networks connecting mines from where you can where you can get the raw materials to factories to then cities, and those infrastructures were already present in terms of shipping routes coming into what were largely coastal cities like Mumbai, cities across the entire coast along the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea. And so that transition needed to happen in those early years, in the mid 20th century, after independence, that the networks upon which contractors depended needed to be made more robust internally. And that was, of course, made possible by the developmental state, because they could put in all sorts of restrictions as to where you get the cement from, and demand that they could put all sorts of constraints on import of materials and things like that. And that allowed the cement industry to develop in ways that we now see. The cement also, because it was this major corporate endeavor, it had a very robust publicity machine as well. And so you can look at the Cement Association of India, or like the Indian Concrete Journal, or there are tons of magazines that are being published that cater to what I was saying earlier, which is the sliding scale of expertise. So, you publish an article saying this is how you can use this one product that we've made for the interior of your house, or for your compound wall, or for your extension project, or anything like that, including drawings of houses, plans that were furnished in these journals, including, cement tiles were a big part of this. So the kind of versatility of the material and the versatility of expertise that could be applied to it, combined with the publicity machine of cement, meant that it became this very accessible way to intervene in what was a rapidly changing and growing world. One more aspect of this, which I wanted to mention, was the aesthetics of concrete, which is that this idea that concrete surfaces are more hygienic, and therefore if we can get rid of any kind of materials like wood or mud or clay and instead replace it with concrete, we can clean it easily. That of course is an idea that has been a very suspect idea, and and rightly so challenged in more recent decades. But in the mid 20th century, the idea that concrete can bring in hygiene and therefore be used as a way to address tropical diseases, or it should be used in health centers, and therefore we need it in villages to reduce child mortality in hospitals. And all of these narratives come together, I think, to transform the use of concrete. I've totally digressed. What I wanted to talk about is that I think something fascinating about, and I talk about this in my essay as well, is the relationship between the granularity of cement and the granularity of grain. Cement doesn't do this thing where it functions as cash. It doesn't have this double role that grain plays. But cement, first of all, also needs to be stored in silos. And so many of the silos being built are actually being built also to store cement at cement factories. And because of this capacity for these commodities to flow, so to be stored in a silo, you have to flow so that you can flow out of the silo. They need to flow physically, but they also need to flow metaphorically. And to flow metaphorically, which is to say flow through the economy. So you have, and that's actually what I was trying to describe, why cement flowed so well through the economy. So all of those things that I was saying about where it's manufactured, shipping networks, et cetera, is the point that I'm trying to make here is that cement flow has to be designed. Flow is not something that just happens automatically. And one of the big transformations that happens both in the history of grain and in the history of cement is that they become commodities which in the capacity to make them flow, in designing the networks through which they will flow, create conditions where we become absolutely dependent on them.
The second part was in terms of the material and technological development in silo making industry, where do you see it going from there, and where is it now, if you were to trace that arc?
Okay, so I think this is where you are interested in that question of the GI silos versus the concrete silos. So the galvanized iron silos, fascinating story. They're coming out of this, I believe, Kansas-based company. Right now it's slipping my mind. I should double check that, but I think it's a Kansas-based company, Butler. So they developed this technology of galvanizing iron, which made it last more. It made it more resistant to corrosion. And this industry was supplying material for the United States' war effort. Now, war demands a lot of steel. The United States government is sponsoring some of the production of this technology. And as a result, when the United States starts sending India grain, because they're overproducing grain, right? Like this is a really key aspect of that entire episode of India importing US grain, is that they have way too much of it. The Indian government needs to build capacity to store the grain that is coming in. And part of the reason that it needs to build this capacity is because it is relying on this grain to function in its money form and not in its food form. Because when you store that grain in the form in which it stores value, like the way in which money stores value, it keeps the price of grain steady. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit. Maybe we can go back to it because you brought up Amartya Sen's work on exchange entitlements. It's just such a fascinating argument that he makes, which is that laborers are not, the value of their labor crashes. So as an individual, your body has the capacity to labor, and then within the marketplace, that capacity that you have has a price, has a value, and that value crashes. When that value crashes, it is not equivalent anymore to the value of grain. So it's not exactly, I would not describe it as a barter system as much as that the market as a site of exchange is, and this really comes out of the theory of the market as being the fundamental place at which value is determined. It is determining these two values to be different. So a laborer's labor is no longer valuable enough to purchase enough rice to support their own metabolic needs. That collapse that happens leads to famine. What that means is that you have to, as a state, maintain those values so that laborers can exchange their labor for rice or for wheat or for whatever grain, whatever carbohydrate is the staple in that region. That is what the silo is doing. The task of the silo is to protect not the food itself, but its value. So what happens is that at the same time with the transformation of the construction industry, okay, sorry, put a pause on that. Let's just quickly address the whole galvanized iron technology. The US government sends these, they're really symbolic. They send 2 silos. They're sending them because they have their own contract with this Butler company. And it becomes a symbol of what they were able to produce out of their war effort, their technological change that came out of World War II. The United States emerges from World War II, the glorious world leader, right? That GI silo becomes a symbol of all of that military and economic prowess of the United States in the world. 2 silos are not going to solve this problem of storing grain. So all throughout this conversation, officials in the government are talking with civil engineers to try and figure out ways to very quickly build storage. And they hope to build various forms of, go downs and silos and shells and various objects. Largely, they just build go downs. What they call, actually in the literature, is called a conventional go down, which is steel truss with load bearing columns, or either concrete columns or brick columns. And so the technology, in a sense, there is one hope for what might be possible, what kinds of possibilities, construction possibilities, architectural possibilities, aesthetic possibilities might come with expertise, what beautiful things we can produce. And then there is the need to build very quickly and store very quickly so that this price of wheat can be protected from what the market might determine it is, given any kinds of fluctuations in the weather and so on.
I want to stay on this topic for a little more because it's uncanny how about 80 years from that World War and that conversation about silo and wheat, we are in the middle of another war, which also involves wheat. And you spoke about the market as a site for exchange. And because of this particular ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and this is something a thread I've been trying to follow throughout the season, is just to try to get a grip on different ways that the war has impacted not just like global supply chains, but also the question of the grain and the wheat and its role in the marketplace as the money, knowing how much wheat Ukraine does export. What's your reading of the present situation through these lens, if you were to look at the grain storage and the role of wheat as the money? How do you read into what is going on right now?
So this is, of course, such a complicated situation that has arisen. I would love to draw some of the historical threads of this complication, of what happened, how India reacted to that particular problem of Ukraine not being able to necessarily export all the wheat that it has historically exported. First of all, just to quickly connect it to that story that I was telling of one place becoming the breadbasket of another or the granary of another. So Ukraine and some of the border states of Russia, including, I could be wrong, but I think Belarus also has, long had a history of exporting grain. I could be wrong about this. I have to double check. Don't quote me on that. Ukraine has been fashioned. So this is a geopolitical history, right, of why one country ends up becoming an exporter of grain to the extent that it becomes specialized in that particular way, that then gets threatened by this horrible war that is dragged on. This horrible war. Let's go to one historical thread on the Indian case. India, in the 40s and 50s, they used to call it living ship to mouth, that the US ship would come and, that's how we would supply people with grain. And so it was this very deeply negative connotation, right? That, we are living ship. It's like living hand to mouth. So instead of saying living hand to mouth, we're saying we're living ship to mouth. And then after the Green Revolution, the slogan was it became a celebration of this capacity, particularly of Punjab, but also of many other states, to produce this bounty and become the granary of India instead of the country having to import grain. And so it became from ship to mouth to shipping out. And what was the pride of this process? The national pride aspect of this, which again has its roots in that long history that I described earlier, like long held debates on being self-sufficient in food production. That shipping out has meant that the government is able to supply not just import, but not just self-sufficient, but also export grain, which was not the goal of the developmental state. The goal of the developmental state was to be able to produce high-end products, high-end in the sense of, complex industrial products, not just raw materials or agricultural produce. So other than that, which was really a change of tack after Nehru's death, the shipping out meant that you could use your grain to bring in, dollars, foreign exchange, things like that, which are very important for economies to position themselves in relation to other economies. You need to export something. India had to make a decision. The Indian government had to make a decision to stop exporting because it needed to reposition itself in relation to other countries, because suddenly the demand for exports would go up, right? Like the price of wheat would go up. Farmers would want to export because they would want to supply to that higher priced market instead of supplying to that. But it would cause an outflow of grain. And that would be detrimental to the internal needs. And not to the internal needs in terms of the quantity of supply, but to the internal needs in terms of the price. Indian consumers would not be able to afford grain, which would possibly, I don't know, this is speculation, there's a worry that it would create all sorts of not just distress, but frustration at the government. And they're trying to manage frustration as much as they are trying to manage distress. So just to clarify, what I'm saying here is that the restriction on export was to prevent the export pressure for the price of grain, given that the price of grain would be pushed up, given that there's less supply in the world in general. What I'm trying to get at here is that it's very much about the price of it rather than the presence of it, if that makes sense. Yeah. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's also the question of how this was dealt with in 2020, with the country facing pandemic pressures, and again a kind of disruption of supply chain of food. And John Reyes writes about this. He has a wonderful essay which I recommend everyone go read if you're interested in this, where what he was saying is that the government stores all of this food in silos and warehouses and in all sorts of various storage mechanisms. They cannot release those stocks. If they release those stocks, at the moment that they release the stocks, they have to pay for them. So when they absorb them, they don't pay for them. They don't account for having paid for them. They do pay for them, they just don't account for it. When they release those stocks, they account for it as being paid for. That is when it reflects on the country's ledger, which then means that they will be downgraded in certain international forums and they won't be able to borrow money as cheaply, or they won't. So again, you see that the decision was made based on how grain functions in its money form rather than on its as a commodity to be consumed. And this, I think, has been of central interest to me as to how the metaphor of cash has shaped the biology of grain. I'm fascinated by how metaphors can be so powerful as to change an object that it is trying to represent.
What's also interesting in your work is, and I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, is that your dissertation is this kind of macroeconomics look on the political economy of a country, the infrastructure developments. You also talk about the emergence of agricultural schools and the skill building that is required to sustain this new emergence, this boom that's suddenly happening. But in your current research and also the courses that you teach, you're also doing a little bit of micro work that's very interesting, because you're still looking at food, but you're looking at it through an almost anthropological perspective. You're looking at the act of cooking, you're talking about the role of a cook, you're looking at recipe books, and then you're still feeding into some of these larger questions. I mean, maybe I read into it a little differently, but I also thought the question of authorship when it comes to executing a recipe was fascinating, because in the way you talk about it, and I didn't think about it that way, is a recipe is a written food text which almost goes out of commission or is rendered reductant the moment the recipe is executed. And the way I thought about it is there's so much of power that the text holds, but there's also so much agency that a cook holds when they are making something. What is your course Feasting and Fasting about?
Yeah, I love teaching that class. It's fun to teach it, and I think the students respond to it really well. I think one of the things that is super interesting about teaching about the history of food is that thinking is one kind of intellectual work, and eating is considered as a very different kind of bodily process. It's not intellectual labor. And even then, I do know that people love to talk about food, and there is tons of material on talking about food, particularly, and how food is represented in social media. And yet we eat so much, right? Most of our lives we don't think about what we eat. And sorry, let me clarify. I'm not saying that we don't think about what we eat. We all think about what we eat all the time. Food is deeply emotional and, complicated, and we think about food all the time. As much as we eat it, we think about it. What I meant to say is that how can we use that process of eating as intellectual work? How can we use the kind of physical bodily process and do intellectual work around that at the same time, which is why I ask my students to cook something that someone else has written a recipe for, because which is, I think, a way to remember that recipes connect us. And the agency of the cook that you brought up there is that you take a recipe, you make it, and you transform it. And in the process of making and transforming it, you make that recipe redundant. And so a recipe is really only something someone needs when they don't know how to cook something. So yes, it is an object that it is a kind of text that does so many different kinds of work. One is that it acts as an archive of how we know something. Recipes are surprisingly hard to move across borders because markets are different. And so recipes have to change when they move across borders, which is why I ask the students to find someone to give them a recipe, and that because then they have to face that challenge of how that recipe will change given the constraints that their lives place on them, their kitchens place on them, the instruments they have, all of these things, how it challenges you to transform these things, which we do it comes to us instinctively, but it's an intellectual process. So that's a little bit what I try to get them at. What I found fascinating is how we don't use it. We don't attribute authorship to it at all. We often will say, "Oh, my mother gave me this." So mother becomes just a kind of signifier of
you never really know if the mother is the author or mother is a resource in this case. Most likely she's a resource, but
they are both because you inherit a recipe and you transform it.
You're the author of that iteration.
The archive of it, exactly, and iterates upon it, exactly. And then we will iterate as well. And recipes are this kind of object that has both that is both simultaneously archive and authored object. But I'm also interested in how food tells a history of power. Famously, something like sugar, and so we will talk about how sugar has transformed economic networks around the world. What are some of the aesthetic implications of that? Aesthetic in the sense of how different artists have used sugar to be able to critique that very long and complicated history of plantations and slavery that has made that commodity possible, that has um, made that commodity accessible, and how much so that commodity has become absolutely central to industrially processed food. What are the other things? So yeah, that class is really fun. It just brings so many of our so many things that we spend so much time thinking. It puts them in historical context, and it helps the students to be able to, I think, develop a capacity to think historically about the everydayness of their lives.
What I really liked, and I thought it was a good kind of like intensive way to make people think about it, is the question of taste. And of course, we were made to read a lot of like French philosophers write about beauty, and then we had a like in-class discussion about the difference between beauty and taste, where beauty is something that's extremely visual and taste is something that is felt or acquired. So even here in your class, when you talk about taste, I thought that that nice like metaphorical translation of taste as like the broad idea of something that you prefer, like it's very preferential to the taste as a sense, I thought was very, very interesting to just tread both the waters in that sense.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how taste has structured our political economies. So what I mean by that is that sometimes we imagine what it is that is important, and it is easy to forget the extent to which the desire for tea shaped the British Empire, or like the desire for spice shaped Portuguese relationship with India. And so economic networks have really built upon gustatory desires.
Very, very interesting. Last question then. What are you currently working on and what's next for you?
I'm currently finishing the book that is the result of this dissertation project, and it's called Famine Landscapes. At least tentatively, it's called Famine Landscapes. I hope it will be done very soon, but these things take the time that they take, and it is going to talk about how famine produces labor, produces ideas of taste, produces the modern political economy of grain, and then produces landscapes that sort of emerge from these particular models of how we form labor. What I try to do in this book is that I try to argue how famine is a kind of political process of that transformed the countryside in late 19th century has also shaped our physical and aesthetic landscapes. And then once that book will be done, I will be very happy for it to be out in the world. After that, I'm working on a history of materials. And so in this, I'm interested in looking at a history of bamboo, plastic, cement, and how they have become central to the intersection between our sort of extractive desires as consumers, and also to how we both protect ourselves from the climate but also have transformed it. So what might be a way to think about material histories and architectural materials that we don't necessarily always think about in architecture in the finished product, but have really been central to shaping modern construction industries. So that's the next project. In the meantime, in between all of that, I'm also interested in questions of expertise. So that will tie into that history of agricultural universities that we talked about. And I've also worked on other materials, so things like bitumen, which is, I think, a fascinating material in terms of the history of roads and paving roads. And hopefully I'll be able to also work on some of the other materials. Yeah, I'm super interested in materials and how they produce certain kinds of relations around them. So bitumen is a material that refers to the history of the oil industry. I'm also interested in surki, which is trying to be a kind of indigenous cement. I'm interested in bamboo because it refers to a kind of ecological history, but at the same time is deeply embedded in labor, in how labor is brought in as a form of expertise itself in construction. And also bamboo and plastic are important in architectural maintenance rather than only construction. And that's one of the things I'm super interested in. So that's it. I think so far that's all the projects that I'm working on.
Good luck for all of them, and thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Vaishnavi.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. For guest and topic suggestions, you can get in touch with us through Instagram or our website arcofcenter.com, both of which are ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thank you for listening.